We recently had the Commons Culture, Media and Sport Committee coming north of the border for the first time. They were in Glasgow to take evidence from BBC and STV executives. Phil Scottish went along and we talked to John Nicolson MP after the event, and I think we have some film of him right now. Once we see the film, we'll come back and I'll bring you up to speed about what guests have left us and what guests have joined us, and we'll talk a bit more about the BBC. So here is the package right now. The Commons Culture, Media and Sport Committee were in Glasgow today. What was the purpose behind the visit?
Well, the Commons Culture, Media and Sport Committee wanted to look at broadcasting in Scotland because, as you know, there's a white paper looking at the future of the BBC, and it's very important we get the Scottish dimension. So I asked the committee if they would come north of the border and come to Glasgow, obviously as the base of most of Scotland's broadcasting, and get witness statements from both the BBC and the STV looking at the future of broadcasting in Scotland, but particularly looking at the role that the BBC plays in our national life.
So what did you hope to find out particularly from the BBC?
Well, the BBC at the moment is piloting 3 separate formats for the new Scottish Six, because there's been a sense in Scotland that our news is too London-based, and that if you want to have a proper news programme on television, it should not simply be confined to news generated from within Scotland. It should also have UK news, it should have international news as well, like BBC Radio Scotland does, or like a newspaper would do. There's something very peculiar about BBC Scotland on television and its news provision. I've often said there could be Armageddon in Carlisle and they might lead on an air show in Carluke. So it's an artificial programme. A lot of people have described it as somewhat couthy. And so I support what the BBC says that it wants to do, which is to have a proper news programme, making decisions based on news merit. So one day the main item on the news might be Scottish, the next day it might be Westminster or Washington. And I think if we did that, which is what the BBC proposes, we'd have a more grown-up news programme, and it would drive up standards and also lead to more jobs here in Scotland.
And yet, the first thing we've heard from the BBC recently about what they're going to do is actually axe programmes such as Scotland 2016, and so far we don't know what's going to replace it.
We don't. Gary Smith, who's the new head of News and Current Affairs, has taken over this job. He's an immensely experienced broadcast journalist who is from Glasgow but has been down in London for many years, and he has looked at how Scotland 2016 performs against its STV rival and has decided it's not holding its audience, it's losing audiences, and he would like to have different priorities. Now, obviously for people who work on the programme that is enormously stressful, but if the resources go to something new and something that he considers better, that is an editorial matter for the BBC, and it's not my job to criticise it or to try and influence it. What I do want to see, however, is a concentration of resources in Scotland. I want to see more money coming to broadcasting in Scotland, and how the BBC distributes that money is a matter for the BBC itself. But I'm very encouraged by the fact that they've piloted 3 separate Scottish Sixes, 3 different formats for this new Scottish Six. My worry is the political pressure coming from London, either to water down their proposals or to go for the softest of the 3, or indeed even to scrap the whole idea altogether.
BBC today denied there was any pressure from London, but did you find that convincing?
No, I don't find it convincing. We know that the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport has appeared before the committee. I cross-examined him, and he said he thought that it was the job of BBC News to bring the country together. Now, that's not the job of BBC News. The job of BBC News is to report the news, not to be a cheerleader for one constitutional settlement or another. And so I was very concerned with what he said. The Director General of the BBC also appeared before our committee, and again I tried to pin him down on whether he'd been subjected to political pressures, and all he would say is that he doesn't succumb to political pressures. But we know that ain't so, because when the government wanted the BBC to take over the provision of licences for the over 75s, the BBC buckled. The BBC is a very political organisation at the top, and the BBC does succumb to pressure. I just don't want it to succumb to pressure over this.
The Scottish Six has been on the agenda for some time, been talked about for years. Do you think we're any closer to it now, really, than we have been at all ever?
We're definitely closer to it because they made pilots. In the old days, one of the problems was a technical problem. How would you cut pieces, how would you cut films in London and get them into the running order in Scotland? But technical advances have meant that that's no longer an issue. It's now a matter of political will. The BBC has made these 3 pilots. They range from entirely anchored in Scotland with a proper news running order through to a very much more watered down version, which I understand would have Jackie Bird sitting in a studio in Glasgow presenting the news headlines before handing over to a presenter in London who would do the grown-up stuff, you know, the foreign affairs stuff, the Westminster politics stuff. And I don't want to see that happen because I think it would be enormously patronising for London to do the main stuff and for us to do the local stuff as they would see it in London. It's also an enormous waste of money to have a parallel studio in London simply to hear a network voice would cost BBC Scotland a great deal of money that should be spent on resourcing the Scottish Six programme, paying for reporters and production crew, perhaps sending reporters abroad to report directly for the new programme.
Is the Scottish Six enough now?
As you know, the BBC in Scotland is less trusted than the BBC in any of the other nations of the United Kingdom. Now, I don't think that's a reflection of the provision of Gaelic broadcasting or of radio broadcasting or of the many other things that the BBC does extremely well. It's about news, and it's because people see our news output in Scotland as not good enough and not having caught up with the developments politically in Scotland since we had our own parliament.
So is the debate about resource and the use of that resource and the money the BBC gets, and not so much about the tone of some of its reports, which some people are suspicious about?
I don't think that's what the controversy is about. I think that the BBC in London is an instinctively conservative establishment institution. It's about a presumption of what the BBC should be about, and that's why I think there was so much controversy at the time of the referendum, because the BBC clearly did not subject the yes camp, I'm talking about the Scottish referendum, to the degree of scrutiny that they subjected the no camp to do. It was a binary choice.
So I don't, what do you mean by that?
Well, it was a binary choice. Do you want to be independent or do you not want to be independent? And the BBC is used to covering general elections, where they subject each of the parties to scrutiny. And obviously, if you have all the parties, bar the SNP and Greens, advocating union, and you only have the SNP and Greens advocating independence, if you simply attribute the amount of time and resources to each party that you would do in a general election, it leads to bias against those who support independence.
Bias specifically in the way that you will have one representative from an independent supporting party and 4 representatives of pro-union parties. Is that what you mean?
That's partly what I mean. Partly also, I think the problem was that the BBC subjected, a lot of people believe, the pro-independence campaign to a lot more scrutiny than those who wanted to uphold the status quo. Now, that is part of the innate conservatism of the BBC. We were, for example, told, were we not, that if we voted for the status quo, we would preserve our place in the European Union, and how wrong that was.
Are you saying that the journalists in the BBC didn't subject those claims to enough scrutiny because they thought the BBC wouldn't have wanted them to do so?
No, I don't think it's as considered as that. I think it is simply a matter of innate conservatism.
If we could talk just very briefly about drama, because I know there was a discussion this afternoon about the lack of any long-running Scottish-based drama, both in BBC and in STV. Why do you think that is? Is that structural, or is it just we don't have the talent to do it?
Well, we definitely have the talent to produce drama. We know that. We export talent, acting talent, directing talent, producing talent. Scotland's full of talent. The problem with drama, as you know, is that it's incredibly expensive to produce, but there's a hunger for drama. Everybody I know has memories of good quality drama coming from Scotland, good quality comedy that came from Scotland as well. But the talent needs to be nurtured and resourced. And clearly there's a real problem of nurturing and resourcing talent, which is an expensive thing to do. And it was actually one of my Conservative colleagues today in the Select Committee who pointed out the huge gulf between what Scottish licence payers spend and give to the network and what is spent in the country. But you see a drama like Outlander, for example, which has been incredibly popular worldwide and shows just what kind of hunger there is for good quality drama with a Scottish dimension. That, of course, is relatively easy to predict. I mean, who doesn't like a man in a kilt? And who doesn't like a historical drama? But we need contemporary dramas as well. We need a range of dramas. And I think Scotland could do a lot better when it comes to provision.
So there's still a lot happening within the BBC. We're still waiting to see, for example, what the results of the BBC's 6 News project is. But Fiona, I was wondering what has the Scottish Government been discussing with the BBC, and where are we in those discussions?
Yeah, well, great to be here on Full Scottish. Thank you for the invitation.
Welcome.
And where the government is for the first time the Scottish Government is involved in the process. And we have to be consulted and we have to be involved throughout. So I managed to secure agreement that we would be involved throughout the process. So one, we're negotiating currently on the clauses to be in the Charter. The Charter was expected over the summer, but it's likely with the new appointment of the new Secretary of State will be a bit later than anticipated. And also discussions with the BBC about how they improve their offer, because they've admitted themselves that they have yet to catch up with devolution. We need to make sure that the spend in Scotland supporting creative industries is there, and also Scotland wants to see itself to itself. Now, as a minister, I would not dictate to the BBC. Clearly, editorial independence is hugely important, but the critical thing is there's got to be devolution of budget and devolution of decision making, and that's what we have yet to see will absolutely happen. Direction of travel seems good, but yet to be convinced.
There was a change in the structure, the internal structure of the BBC in terms of representations of Scotland, and a change from individual representation for Scotland, England and Wales, I think, to one person, Jerry Hassan, one person representing regions and nations.
Yeah.
How do you feel that is that a step forward for the BBC or a retrograde step?
It's a retrograde step, and you have to see how Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are done, and then how the BBC has consistently, as Fiona has just said, they've been behind the curve on the changing nature of Britain for the last 20 years. And so this is a problem how the BBC understands and really doesn't understand and doesn't represent Britain. So you end up with a head of nations and regions. That's retrograde. It's despite all the talk of diversity about Britain, it's kind of centralisation, and really it's the issue of how are those audiences, how are the nations portrayed, how do they feed into a different kind of portrayal of Britain, however that then constitutionally exists, and how is BBC Scotland accountable to Scottish audiences, which it isn't in any real direct sense at the moment.
Because there was BBC internal research which showed, I think, that most people in Scotland, a very small majority, but nevertheless a majority of people in Scotland, felt that the BBC was not representing the country in a way that they recognised.
No, you have that, and I mean the BBC have researched this till ad nauseum, and there's a democratic deficit in terms of news and current affairs in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. But what it comes down to is how you do kind of power in the way. I think this is an overstatement that gets you into something simplistic, but lots of people in broadcasting and media say BBC Scotland is a fiction. It doesn't exist in any way as an autonomous body with complete control over its own budget. BBC Scotland famously came into existence in 1968 when Alistair Miller just renamed the BBC in Scotland, just took the frontage of the building at Broadcasting and put Scotland onto BBC. And basically, fundamentally, power hasn't shifted. Despite all our talk of 20 years of devolution, the BBC in the UK won't let a BBC Scotland come into existence, and that's what has to happen so we can see ourselves represented back to ourselves.
Although there have been, I think, Fiona, some steps forward as a result of discussions and negotiations with the Scottish Government, although, as you say, it's not telling them how to report the news.
No, I mean, the irony is the Clementi review, which was looking at the board structure, the new board structure, actually accepted our arguments that there should be individual representation from Scotland, individually from Wales and Northern Ireland. Now, the irony is that that's happened at board level, but not necessarily at management level. The management level is less of concern if there is transfer of budget and decision making. If there's a transfer of budget and decision making, that is the big difference. But for 55% of licence fee money only to be put back into the Scottish, broadcasting economy isn't good from a strategic point of view to make sure we're growing the talented people that we have. There's great talent there, and we want to support what the BBC can do. It's unrealised potential, and for Scotland to flourish in lots of different ways, it needs the BBC to be fully functioning at its best. Good talented journalists there, they need to have the scope and capability, and that really is a management decision. And in my discussions with both Tony Hall and also with the UK government in terms of what's going to be in the white paper, we want as much in the charter that identifies the need for the nations and regions to be properly reflected. So interesting times. A lot will happen in the next couple of weeks. We expect the news review in terms of what they're looking at in terms of improving that to come through. I think that's what John Nicolson would have been referring to in his piece. But also, as I said, the Charter. And the Scottish Parliament, for the first time, will have the Charter presented to it. So that's some shift, but we haven't had the power in decision making. And unless you've got power in decision making, that's where the key ask is.
I would love to see much more. I mean, at the moment, I pay my licence fee by direct debit. I pay it because I have to, but I happily choose to pay other channels to watch the programmes that I really, really want to watch. There's nothing on the BBC in Scotland at the moment that I would happily pay for to download and watch. And I think younger people view programmes differently. They consume their television and their media very, very differently. Shona, do you think the BBC needs to change somehow to tap into that audience?
I suppose the difficulty there is that the licence fee system is not market driven. So the BBC produces a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily be made if it was just a purely commercial broadcaster going where the audiences are, obviously, but then you still have things like Strictly Come Dancing and The Voice and things that are very obviously competing with the commercial providers. And some people would say, well, do we actually need that? And why are we setting up this ratings battle? That's not what the BBC is for. Doesn't mean it can't do entertainment, but is it really fulfilling its remit at all by providing these shows?
Because when you were talking, Fiona, when you were mentioning...
I like Strictly. I'm sorry.
Me too. I like Strictly too. My life would be much less...
It could be made commercially.
Scottish Strictly.
No,
Strictly Scottish.
but Fiona, you mentioned the kind of devolution of power and decision making, and we've been talking largely about news, but I guess from my point of view as well, I'm interested in seeing some more drama.
Well, if you want a sustainable future, you have to have recurrent drama, because that gives the job certainly to the crews, and also developing the writers and the whole aspect. And actually, one of the public service requirements of the BBC should be, I think, and it's what we're arguing, is about making sure we've got a good creative, strong sector, creative industries, that they should be growing. And the BBC should not just be harvesting the talent from people; they should be helping grow the talent and fostering the best journalism for the future and the best writers for drama. And drama is key because it's the volume of activity that it creates. But quite frankly, Weather, Question Time, Countdown, not particularly Scottish. Very rarely have the third party of the United Kingdom Westminster Parliament represented on it. Is hardly Scottish. So I think what we want is also the content, and it doesn't have to be quiche and it doesn't have to be parochial. It's the international perspective is what we want. I'd much rather see something like Channel 4 News, but with a Scottish domestic agenda reflected within that. I think that the capacity and the capability of the Scottish audiences to want and demand international news is very, very strong, and I think we underestimate it in terms of the ambition. And we want BBC to be ambitious. Currently, they're not nearly as ambitious as they can and should be.